Friday. We'll be talking with Alexander about that, and then we're going to continue our conversation on trade with Lori Wallach. There is so much to talk about. It's just you and I today, listeners and WBAI community members. King is off in the field covering truth, justice, and the un-American way. He'll be back tomorrow. Stay with us. Welcome to the program, everyone. It's 61 degrees going up to a high of 71 degrees. Cloudy early today with peaks of sunshine expected late, like right before sunset. So be ready for that. High of 71 tonight. It's going to be 54 degrees. I really enjoyed that cool night last night. Tomorrow it's going up to 73 and will be mainly sunny, a beautiful fall day. And then Friday, 83 degrees, mainly sunny. Again, another beautiful fall day. The weekend's going to be hotter. It's 86 degrees. Too bad the beaches are already closed, and 85 degrees on Sunday. So there you have it. Have you been paying attention? There's so much going on. It's insane. I mean, we need to talk a little bit about what happened with the New York Times and their coverage of the coverage that we did, covering what they did about Kavanaugh and the Kavanaugh hearings. Not the hearings, excuse me, but the revelation in the New York Times book review that another woman had what they suggested was come forward when really she didn't come forward. Just witnesses saw his behavior at a college party. The woman claims to not remember it, but then when reminded of it, she says, "Oh yeah, I remember it." And I thought that there's a whole kerfluffle going on with the New York Times around it, but I thought that was actually quite telling because I too went to one of these colleges on a scholarship where, of course, you kind of wouldn't remember it because it's an everyday occurrence with these frat type guys. That's just the way it was. Hopefully was. And thank you to the Me Too movement for making this not the way things are anymore. No boys will be boys. And then, of course, all of the Democratic candidates who came out and said we should impeach him are getting, dragged through the mud by the right-wing media because they said those things right away. I don't understand why calling for an impeachment investigation for a Supreme Court justice is so terrible. Why is calling for an investigation into a Supreme Court justice based on something reported by what is supposed to be the paper of note, so trusting that the paper vetted the information, etc.? I don't see why that is such a problem. But they're the right wing is basically saying all of the people, Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, Warren, all the people who came out and said we need an investigation. Julian Castro, I think, was another one. Impeachment, people, is an investigation. So let us not be fooled by the smears. And also, folks are saying that this New York Times failure is playing right into Trump's hands. Well, of course, he's looking for any little thing to attack media all of the time. And far be it from me to defend the New York Times because they certainly have, we all know, enough shadiness in their history and present reporting to, make one to turn your head a little bit. But here we are. The Times is reporting today. They kind of not reporting on that anymore. They're trying to quietly erase the mistake. And thankfully, Trump is doing enough horrible things that they can easily do that. So, by the way, the global climate strike is happening this September 20th, just ahead of a UN emergency climate summit, and again on the 27th, by the way. Alexander Kaufman's joining us later in the show to talk about it. But I did want to point out something that I believe Trump has been doing every time there is a major movement that is, of global implication, including the Women's March, the Science March, a whole number. Every time I've noticed that there's a giant march, Trump does something to sort of assert his dominance right before. And I would suggest trying to dampen spirits. This time, he is going to announce later today that he is going to revoke California's authority to set stricter auto emission rules. Yes. these California's rules are stricter than federal standards. This was a major step toward, cleaning up its own air. And California is a huge economy on its own. And it's important that those economies where people live are making these kind of green choices if we're going to be addressing climate change that Trump doesn't believe in. The formal abolition of one of California's signature environmental policies. Tailpipe pollution, by the way, is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. Again, is going to be announced this afternoon at the Washington headquarters of the EPA. I mean, seriously.
Are you kidding?
I'm not kidding. That's exactly, it's sickening. It's absolutely sickening. Anyway, Trump at the time will be traveling in California, where he's scheduled to attend some fundraisers in Los Angeles and Silicon Valley. Hopefully activists will find out where he is and get out there with the protest signs. Lawyers said the action takes the administration into some uncharted legal territory in its battle with the state, which has vowed to fight the change all the way to Supreme Court. I'm not sure if that's going to do anyone any good, since we have some real capitalists up on that Supreme Court, real corporate-friendly Trump lovers on that Supreme Court. Anyway, a professor of environmental law at New York University is quoted as having said this is unprecedented and a tremendously big deal. He said that no administration has ever revoked a state's authority to regulate its own air quality in the past. So states' rights are important when you are oppressing people and removing their civil liberties, not so much important when the people of the state make their own laws and rules for their own health. In a speech on Tuesday, Andrew Wheeler, the head of the EPA, said that they embrace federalism and its role, the role of the states, but federalism does not mean that one can dictate standards for the nation. Well, were they dictating standards for the nation? No. They were just dictating what they want. Of course, it changed their marketplace so that people needed to buy these cars. So that, of course, rippled into car makers having to make more of these cars. And then there's more of those cars are available. Yikes. Okay, so this is happening right in the face of the Tuesday global climate strike that's happening in New York City and all around the world. Greta Thunberg is being given a lot of credit for, inspiring this. She's a young person, and we have a clip of her speaking here that I want to play for you. Here it comes.
We are the younger generation. We are the ones who are going to be affected, and therefore we demand justice.
What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now!
Everyone should mobilize for the 20th and the 20th of September, because this is a global issue which actually affects everyone. We are all in the same boat, so everyone should be concerned about this.
Me movilizo porque somos un movimiento mundial.
I'm striking because if we don't fight for our future now, soon we won't have a future left to fight for.
私は次の世代への平等を求めてマーチに参加します。
Je soutiens aussi la grève des enfants pour que les décideurs du climat puissent appuyer pour que l'avenir soit radieux pour nous tous.
Eu vou participar da greve pelo clima no dia 20 de setembro de 2019 porque eu acredito que é responsabilidade nossa cuidar da nossa casa.
And we stand with the youth who are taking a stance today and raising up their voice to be able to have a real impact.
从去年开始，我们看到全球的年轻人开始展开行动。那我们了解到，气候变迁它会影响到的不是这一个世代，还有下个世代。
Jeg synes, det er vigtigt at være med i de globale klimastrække i september, fordi det her det kan være den sidste chance, vi har for at råbe politikerne op til at handle på klimakrisen.
Я вийду на Global Climate Strike, тому що відчуваю свою власну відповідальність за те, що відбувається зараз на планеті.
I'm joining the strikes because I believe it's time to resist and to take charge of the future that belongs to us, not to the fossil fuel companies.
我们应该立即展开行动，不管是政府、企业、个人。
We stand with Greta and all those fighting for our future.
We need you to be a part of it because we need every age involved. Young people have been leading here, but now it's the job of the rest of us to back them up.
This shouldn't be the children's responsibility, because now the adults also need to help us. So we are calling for them to strike from their work, because we need everyone. There is nothing we can't do, and I mean, if not you should do it, then who else? And if not we should do it now, then when should we do it?
New York City schools said will not be penalized if they walk out of their schools. So that could make a big difference on the numbers of who is going to be coming to this climate strike. It's really an exciting thing that's happening here in our city and all across the world. Anyway, over the last year, millions of school climate strikers have been leaving the classrooms every Friday, and young people have woken up, by the way, to what's happening. And on September 20th, to coincide with the big UN climate meeting, if you haven't heard already, you can support this youth's call for adults to join them in the streets, which you just heard Greta Thunberg, who is like the star of the movement. I don't understand why we have to have a star of the movement every time, not to take away from her work, but I think it's really important that we don't make people one person responsible. Just like Bernie Sanders says, it's not me, it's us. I think this climate movement has to be, it's not me, it's us also. I do remember on my old show having Bill McKibben on to talk about, I believe it was one of the first climate marches here in New York City in the recent days. I think it was maybe 7 years ago, something like that. And he said, listen, I don't really want to be the star of this movement. This is just work that I've been doing. People are making me a star of this movement, and we need to realize that each and every person is just as important as everyone else. But it was great to hear her, Greta, to urge communities to stop work for a day, leave your lab, your office, your classroom, and go to the global climate strike. It is, by the way, Friday, starting at 12 p.m. to 5. You can go to Foley Square right here in New York City at 1 Street, New York, 11000. If you're going to send an envelope, 10013. You're listening to Waking Up. I'm Juliana Forlano. King's not in the studio with us today. He is down in D.C. covering some sort of justice conference. We may try to get him on the air to let us know what's going on, or we'll just have him report back tomorrow when he joins us again. It's 61 degrees, going up to 71 degrees. We'll be right back after this break with Alexander Kaufman.
Former ESPN anchor Jemele Hill created kind of stir with a piece in The Atlantic where she argued that black athletes should stop attending white majority colleges. What's your reaction to this?
Well, I read the article, and when I saw the uproar over it, I read the article, and I agree with her. She had some great points in that article. When you look at the history of HBCUs and you look at the hundreds of thousands of black professionals that have come from these schools over the course of the last several years since they've been created, and you look at what's been lost since integration has happened, what she was saying was simply that athletics is a multi-billion-dollar business. I went to two historically white universities, Duke University and University of Georgia, that have a lot of money based on athletics. What she was saying that, look, we're living in a time where there's a big racial wealth gap. The average white family has a net income, a net worth that's 10 times that of a black family. And so if we're able to have some of these athletes that create so much income go to some of these schools, not that white students don't go and students of other ethnicities don't go. We live in a time where everybody can go wherever they want to. But what she was saying simply, if we're trying to pump money and revenue into some of these communities, that there's still this big disparity, this may be a way to do it. Obviously, that's in a vacuum. Yeah. There are other factors to figure into that. But when you read her argument, look, she lays it out very, very cleanly, and it's actually something that I agree with.
All right, Benjamin. Well, I think that Duke would have not been thrilled about your not being there, but we'll leave it at that. I mean, the college sports would certainly be a lot different today if we went down a color-coded way of figuring out college admissions. I mean, that's resegregating the country. Why do we want that?
Well, no, because segregation, as you know, is government mandated.
Yeah, I get it.
This is not segregation. Yeah. This is if you read the article and see what
I read the article. All right, we got to go.
That wasn't the question.
I am answering your question.
Which period was America great that we're trying to replicate? Which era was it? Tell me.
I think I'll answer your question.
Tell me.
I'm ready to answer your question.
Which era was it?
What?
Which era was so great?
Here's the thing that you guys are forgetting. America was actually one of the Slavery was all over the world.
Answer the
All over the
question.
world.
Man,
America
answer
was.
the question.
I'm not saying it's okay. So why are you saying oh?
Hey, man.
America was one of the first countries.
I want to like you so
but I
bad.
can't. I'm
Because
trying to
you're
answer
so
your question.
smart. I want to like you so
If I
much.
can't answer the
I want to
question,
hear
it
y'all.
doesn't
I want to be able to hear them. I want to be able to hear
If I
them.
can't answer the question and you're just going to boo when I say slavery was all over the world, which is a fact, why are you booing a fact?
Because you're making light of.
No, I'm not.
You're making light
I
of
haven't
the
gotten into my
enslavement
points. I'm not
of
making.
people that look like us. You can't make light of that. That ain't nothing you
I haven't
breeze
even
over.
finished the sentence. How am I making
You
light of
started
anything?
with some bullshit.
Okay.
What a beautiful song. I love that song. Really keeps you enthusiastic in the morning. We Are Young by Fun. You're listening to Waking Up. I'm Juliana Forlano in the studio without my far left-hand man, which is what he calls himself, King Downing. We miss him this morning, but he will be back tomorrow. Going on, as we've talked about, September 20th, just ahead of a UN Emergency Climate Summit. And again on September 27th, there is a global climate strike happening. Going on climate strike means people everywhere walking out of their homes, offices, farms, factories. Everyone is needed, by the way, to disrupt business as usual. From sports stars, actors, teachers, to WBAI show hosts and producers, to WBAI listeners, actors, teachers, food industry workers, psychologists, delivery drivers, and everything in between. Alexander Kaufman, reporter at HuffPost, who writes about climate change and regularly appears here on our show, is with us today to talk about the importance of this climate strike. Alexander, thanks again for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Can you talk about the significance of this particular global climate strike?
Sure. This is probably one of the most organized and exciting grassroots movements around this to happen in a long time. This is kind of building off of a lot of the work that, you're seeing teenage activists both here and in Europe really push for. Greta Thunberg is obviously one of the more famous ones, but there are several here in the U.S. as well. Jamie Margolin, who's a teenager from Seattle, Alexandria Villasenor, who's a teenager from New York City. And,
Alexander, why do we have to have famous people doing it? Is the question I have.
These people are, particularly the ones in the U.S., are not particularly famous just yet. I mean, their profiles have certainly been raised in recent months as they've been doing this campaigning. But they have successfully organized potentially hundreds of thousands of people to take off on Friday and really make a big deal out of this. And you have
that makes sense then.
You have
sure.
strikes scheduled all over the country, in Oklahoma and Texas and, all over the place. So while the New York one will probably be the biggest, this is a viral movement.
Mm-hmm. It's going to be live streamed on MoveOn's website, by the way, just in case you wanted to know that. And I think Act.tv is going to be live streaming it as well. I'm sure there's other independent media sources who are live streaming it too. Can you talk in terms of climate activism? Do you think the strikes represent a significant change in thought and momentum around climate justice work?
It certainly centers climate justice work in a way that previous climate movements haven't. The climate movement has been so focused for a long time on just overcoming climate denialism and not necessarily advocating for climate policy that matched the severity of the problem.
I think all the fires and floods and enormous hurricanes have pretty much convinced almost everyone. I mean,
sure. Also, the mounting evidence in the IPCC report last year really was a big turning point in public understanding of how severe this crisis is. So, this movement is definitely different from climate marches in the past in the sense that it is, going beyond saying, hey, we need to stop denying science, and saying instead, hey, we need to take radical action to curb emissions. But, it's worth noting that this movement and what Greta Thunberg has been pushing for and everything is not necessarily married to any individual policy. So it's not, this doesn't automatically translate into Green New Deal or, something like it. It is just calling for policy that is on the scale of what they're protesting against.
What do you make of the fact that they're calling it a climate strike, asking people to walk out of their, using labor terminology, it's not just a protest or a rally, it's a strike, asking people to walk out of what they're doing in order to participate?
Well, certainly at the moment when the UAW workers at the GM plant in Detroit are on strike right now, that will certainly bring home that similarity and the fact that this is akin to what's happening in labor. I mean, I'm not sure. It's hard to assign particular meaning to that, given that this was a movement that was popularized in Europe, where
they strike.
Where they strike.
They have general
Right,
strikes in general. Yeah.
But looking at the landscape in the United States over the past 2 years, I mean, the teacher strikes, now the UAW strikes, and this growing labor movement, is exciting, and so it is easy to see how there are some clear synergies between what's happening here and what's happening more broadly with workers.
Can you talk a little bit about what might be happening in the UN Emergency Climate Summit? What are they doing inside? We know about the strike outside, but what are they doing inside?
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of talks. There's going to be a lot of discussion about how to move forward on different goals and different plans. I mean, I wouldn't hold my breath for whatever comes out of it. The UN is a famously bureaucratic institution, and it is one that is famously beholden to some of its more powerful members, namely the United States, which is
Are we even going?
quite eager.
Are we?
Well, yes,
We're
yeah,
going.
but-
Hey,
but-
that's a plus.
But
Yeah.
but you are going to have the United States and the Brazilian government of Jair Bolsonaro, teaming up and likely, serving as they have in the past as an obstacle to real change and to real substantive discussion. So attendance, it does not mean constructive attendance.
Perhaps the United Nations should take a look at what's happening in the U.S. and really try to strengthen the votes from other nations or somehow dicker around with their rules, because these forces of fascism and plutocracy are dickering around with the rules here in the United States to make sure that no one gets prosecuted, for example, or that Trump doesn't have to follow any rules, for example, when he decides that he is going to, not the thing he's doing in California about not allowing, them to have set their own pollution standards for their driving cars. Just a suggestion to the UN, in case anyone's listening, in case our ambassador is listening this morning.
I'm sure a lot of ambassadors from some of the low-lying island countries that are, represented in the UN and that are frequently frustrated by the U.S.'s obstinance on climate issues, given that their entire nations are at stake, would agree with that.
What do you think the significance is to these strikes being led by young people? And do you think that presents any advantage or disadvantage?
I mean, I think it presents an advantage in terms of, it has been a really hopeful and compelling media narrative. It has really excited people, and it has really driven home this idea of, who is being robbed by climate inaction, and, this kind of sense of generational guilt or debt rather, that exists between, older generations who have produced the majority of the world's emissions. The half of the emissions that are in the atmosphere came, in the last 30 years or so, when the science was very clear on this. And so that is a powerful thing. If there is a downside to it, I mean, it has made the forces of denial and delay emboldened, to point out that their opponents now are mere children. It's easy for some who are already not convinced to dismiss this as just a bunch of kids And
especially given how our current administration views kids as both sexual toys from Trump and Epstein and all those ilk to just people you can cage. They certainly, children doesn't hold a lot of weight, it seems like, for one particular group.
I hadn't thought about that, but that is a fair point.
Thank you. This is why I like these conversations. We're speaking with Alexander Kaufman. He's a reporter from the HuffPost, writing about climate change, environmental policy, and the politics of life on a warming planet. Alexander, are you going to the strike? Are you walking out of the HuffPost office? Oh, that's terrific.
I won't be walking out as a striker, but I will be there as a reporter.
Oh, it's unfortunate. I know. I feel like I've had to do that too, where there's two different kinds of behavior. When you're a reporter, you're just serious, down the line reporting. When you're a striker, you've got a sign and you can yell, and it's great.
Yeah, I've spent almost my entire adult life as a reporter, so I haven't been able to ever have the fun of doing activism, but I have certainly been witness to a lot of exciting events over the past decade, kind of starting with the rise of Occupy and seeing this culminate now.
I went to in Charlotte, I went to the Democratic convention and as a reporter, and I sat in the press box for part of it. And then I decided to go sit in the audience, and no one knew who I was sitting there because, hey, radio. So, you can kind of hide, and it's great. And I was able to really kind of participate in that way. Beyonce sang. I mean, I didn't have to be like, Beyonce, let me take a note. She's wearing XYZ. It was like, wow, I could, it was real. You could really kind of get into it and really feel the crowd. So we have, I didn't give the phone number, which I will if you have another minute or two, Alexander, to see if folks have questions about this. 212-209-2877 is our listener call in line as we head toward the end of the segment. I'm happy to take some of your calls, or perhaps Alexander would be able to respond. Alexander, do you have any thoughts about what is happening? I know we weren't going to talk about this, but it just happened, and it seems like it's about to be happening, about Trump revoking California's authority to set stricter auto emission rules.
Yeah, so this is something that they've been threatening to do for about a year. It is obviously quite frustrating to many people who see the Trump administration's hypocrisy as just head exploding. I mean, this is for an administration backed by a conservative movement that has long prioritized championing states' rights, and who, his last EPA administrator was the attorney general who led the states' rights fight against the Obama EPA to block power plant regulations. And now they are attempting to do something that no president has ever attempted to do, which is to revoke California's Clean Air Act waiver that it has had since the passage of the Clean Air Act.
I mean, they're just acting with impunity here. They're doing things that are illegal. They're setting themselves up with Barr as the AG so that they don't ever have to prosecute people who are breaking the law. We're in very scary times here in the United States in terms of democracy.
But in terms of that impunity, this is something that will obviously be legally contested. And, there was a report that came out of the NYU School of Law last year that found that the EPA and the White House actually doesn't have the legal authority to revoke one of these waivers once it's granted. So it is unclear how that will be ruled on.
Do you believe if they go up to the Supreme Court that our corporate-friendly Supreme Court wouldn't find a way to just dismiss, the law?
It's hard to say. I mean, this is fundamentally based on the idea that California does disproportionately suffer from worse air pollution than other parts of the country, which is part of its geographical layout, and this will require essentially proving in court that CO2 doesn't cause climate change and doesn't cause air pollution, and that smog isn't a problem, which I think they would have a very difficult time finding expert witnesses that could convincingly tell the court that that's the truth.
Alexander, we have some calls coming in. Let's see if we can take a caller or two before we have to end the segment. I appreciate you being on the line to answer some of these calls. Caller, you are on the air. Your name and where you're calling from.
My name is Denise. I'm from Brooklyn.
Hi, Denise.
And I participated. I'm going to say real fast. I know there's a lot of people who want to say something.
No, go ahead.
I participated in the strikes previously. Nothing has really changed. I wanted to say one thing. In my opinion, I think that we should really look at perhaps not buying any new cars this year. I think that the message would get a little more gravity for people who are the powers that be. Also for the children, the youth division. These cell phones are, with this 5G thing, it's going to make a lot of problems with people's health, particularly very, very young people, younger than teenagers, adolescents, toddlers. And it's going to make a lot of problems in the environment. The youth is not addressing that because they're not knowledgeable about that.
Because no one's reporting on it at all. Even when I tried to get a person on to report, I'm going to have to get some other experts. So when I tried to get someone on, it was like their phone didn't work because they didn't have a 5G phone or whatever.
We've got a WBAI person who is right on the money, Gary Knowles. There needs to be like little pamphlets given out. There needs to be experts in the field who are selling products like solar energy products, actually mixed in with what's going on with this activity. In my opinion, I think with the strike situation, they want to make it like it's a job situation, but this is a life situation. So that's why I think the vernacular is being switched around to have a different kind of a feel. And we should not, as I say, take the hype. But this is what, in my opinion, I think this is what needs to start to happen. We need to get information to everybody to have them understand the layperson. If you're a WBAI listener, you are no longer a layperson. You know what time it is, and you have some clout to give information out, but we don't have the kind of win that we need. And so perhaps since his brother is with the media, maybe he can do something, just maybe do a little article today.
Denise, thank you so much. I will see if let's have Alexander respond. Alexander, Denise covered a number of things. First, have you covered any of the potential environmental impacts of 5G?
So the biggest thing with 5G is that it is likely to disrupt a lot of existing weather forecasting technology, and that is extremely dangerous, particularly as we are seeing, a growing number of really powerful storms that are made more powerful by climate change. And without
is this already happening? Because I have found that you cannot get a decent weather forecast these days already.
Not quite, no.
So there's some other reason that's occurring. Okay.
So, forecasts like political polling are a snapshot in time, and storms change directions as campaigns, change directions.
Well, I think the climate has also changed these days. So the ability to predict, it's slightly chaotic more so than it has been in the past.
That's true.
Yeah. And the other question, Denise talked about boycotts, organizing boycotts. How do you think that would be effective as well?
It's hard to say just speaking broadly, but I think it would be foolish to dismiss anything outright. And she's right that this is a life and death situation, particularly for working class people who, as we've seen in the past,
that would be all of
disasters
us.
are not prioritized by even our government, much less other ones. And so, anything, I think anything helps as long as it isn't advocating for, eco-fascism or something like that.
Yeah, I also agree that anything helps, including these strikes. I mean, the students they have to come together. They have to see that they have some force. They have to see that adults do care. That that's where I disagree with Denise. That when you say nothing happens, it's probably because nothing is reported. I mean, some of the things that happen I'm sure you know, Denise, because you were there, as you make connections. And then from those connections, other things happen. And then, just like we were talking about Occupy yesterday, a lot of the things that you're seeing now, the movements, the media, have all come out of Occupy. So hopefully these actions, if they don't make everyone in the UN agree to the Paris Accord or more, it doesn't mean nothing has happened. And I stand by that. We're talking with Alexander Kaufman. Alexander, do you have time for one more phone call?
Sure.
Oh, bless you. Caller, you are on the air. Your name and where you're calling from.
Yo, it's Mario from the Bronx.
Hi, Mario.
I have a comment, a question. and a wish maybe. I wish that people would protest this much for everyone to have housing and to have proper salaries. You know, they're going to complain about the weather. Okay.
Okay, Mario, this is ridiculous. Hang up. We're done, Mario. No, I'm sorry. This is crazy time. Okay, we can protest for housing and fair jobs, but if Alex, you want to do it?
You know, I will say, you know, I actually very much empathize with where Mario is coming from. You know, I think there are a lot of really urgent economic crises that are affecting people, and you know, this has always been the problem with climate change, that it is something that feels on the horizon, and if you don't know that there's going to be a roof over your head next week, frankly, it's not that big of a concern.
Right.
So, you know, I think it's really important to note that a lot of the people who are working on drafting, you know, Green New Deal and things around that have put a very serious emphasis on housing. You know, there is,
and
in
jobs.
particular, there's a writer and sociologist named Daniel Aldana Cohen. He writes often for Jacobin, and he has really he is like the guy on housing and the Green New Deal, and the need for sustainable, energy efficient, beautiful and desirable public affordable housing, which I think is really inspiring, and I think has probably influenced some of the housing plan that Bernie has come out with.
Tell people the name of the writer again so they can find him or her.
Daniel.
Yeah.
Aldana, Aldana, Cohen, Cohen.
Great. We will take a look at Daniel and see if we can have him on the show also. Alexander, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you staying long. We've got a lot going on in the climate and this big event happening on Friday. I appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
All right, we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks, as we are wont to do. You're listening to Waking Up. I'm Juliana Forlano, WBAI 99.5 FM. Stay tuned. We will have Lori Wallach after this break.
Former ESPN anchor Jemele Hill created kind of stir with a piece in The Atlantic where she argued that black athletes should stop attending white majority colleges. What's your reaction to this?
Well, I read the article, and when I saw the uproar over it, I read the article, and I agree with her. She had some great points in that article. When you look at the history of HBCUs and you look at the hundreds of thousands of black professionals that have come from these schools over the course of the last several years since they've been created, and you look at what's been lost since integration has happened, what she was saying was simply that athletics is a multi-billion-dollar business. I went to two historically white universities, Duke University and University of Georgia, that have a lot of money based on athletics. What she was saying was that, look, we're living in a time where there's a big racial wealth gap. The average white family has a net income, a net worth that's 10 times that of a black family. And so if we're able to have some of these athletes that create so much income go to some of these schools, not that white students don't go and students of other ethnicities don't go. We live in a time where everybody can go wherever they want to. But what she was saying simply, if we're trying to pump money and revenue into some of these communities, that there's still this big disparity, this may be a way to do it. Obviously, that's in a vacuum. Yeah. There are other factors to figure into that. But when you read her argument, look, she lays it out very, very cleanly, and it's actually something that I agree with.
All right, Benjamin. Well, I think that Duke would have not been thrilled about your not being there, but we'll leave it at that. I mean, the college sports would certainly be a lot different today if we went down a.
You're listening to Waking Up on WBAI 99.5 FM. Okay, I have to apologize to Mario, who called in with a decent point, but I always hate. I feel like a lot of callers call in and be like, everything you're doing, not me personally, but you know, everything everybody else is doing is terrible, and we should do this other thing. Well, at least somebody's doing something. I think we gotta. If you're an activist in some way, fine. But I don't like this pooping on other people's work, even if it's not going to turn out, you know, at 100% the way we want. Anyway, moving on. When it comes to a trade war with China, there's a delicate balance that all U.S. presidents have had to deal with. Trump talks about China all the time, and I get to use my China sound effect, which is really awesome. Anyway, the U.S. continues to negotiate with China, seeking a fundamental reform of Chinese approaches to economic development, but they have made little progress and have stopped short of upending the entire global economy, but just barely short until Trump. What are the implications of Trump's trade war with China, and how are ordinary American workers impacted? We are lucky enough to have Lori Wallach joining us on the show again. She's the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, a 25-year veteran of congressional trade battles, starting with the 90s fight over NAFTA. Lori was named to Politico's 50 list of thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics in 2016 for her leadership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership debate, where we had many an on-air conversation. Lori, thanks for joining us on the program. I appreciate it.
Thank you, and good morning.
So I'm so glad that you could come back on so soon, because I feel like our last conversation, we didn't get to talk about China, and that's a major thing that's going on here. Why is Trump so intent on punishing China for their trade practices, and how do those practices hurt in the U.S. in reality?
So we do need a different China trade policy approach in the United States. That is clear.
Talk about why, in case people have not been following trade.
The policy the Democratic and Republican presidents have followed for decades has resulted in an enormous trade imbalance. It's at a certain point been almost $500 billion. It is regularly between $350 and $400 billion. And even the proponents of the trade status quo believe that that imbalance and the shock that got caused after the United States Congress approved a bilateral agreement with China in 2000 that facilitated China's entry into the WTO. This China shock resulted in the loss of at least 3 million U.S. jobs, and contrary to the people who predicted that China's entry into the WTO would, in the long term, be a benefit, now many of those who supported that are admitting that in wide parts of the country, the China shock, the job loss, has resulted in permanently devastating whole regions and communities where economic opportunities that were anchored in good middle-class manufacturing jobs went away, never came back, and whole areas have been depressed with broad economic and social implications. And the key study for folks who want to read up on this was written by a guy named David Autor, A-U-T-O-R. There's a whole series of these studies. He is also the guy who then overlapped the questions of what the economic impact of China was and what things like lowering the life expectancy for people and what has happened with different social ills of opioid addiction, et cetera, overlapping what the China shock economically meant socially.
And can you talk about, well, there was a lot in there. I'm reminded of what's happening in those spaces where the jobs are gone, which is Trumpism has risen. And, do you think people understand that Trump is just more of the same and not a savior, or when it comes to the policies or the issue of trade?
So here's the situation with China particularly. He's identified the right problem. And to some degree, many Democratic presidents and presidential candidates created the dynamic where Trump was able to exploit what is a real lived experience of people. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that he's getting right the solution of how you fix that ill. So he's exploited a real problem. And for too long, we've had Democratic and Republican presidents alike pushing this same corporate rigged, all the smart people think this is the way to do it, China policy, that has made some big companies much more wealthy but has not delivered on the promises, which were, by the way, for folks to remember back there in that debate in 2000, there were two promises. This was going to be good economically for us and China, and it was going to make China more democratic and improve human rights conditions and basically transform China into a country that would enter the global marketplace and become more like us. And in fact, over time, not only have these economic damages happened across the U.S., but also China has effectively financed its buildup of a huge military and for the current elite who are basically one interchangeable body of commercial elite, government elite, and military elite. A lot of the big Chinese government-owned companies actually are owned by the People's Liberation Army, and it has a whole economic wing that in part literally finances the buildup of the military. Human rights conditions have simultaneously gotten worse.
Well, it doesn't seem like Trump really cares about human rights conditions. I mean, he doesn't care about them here. He's not going to care about them over there.
This is what I'm getting at of what he's not doing.
Yeah.
There are perhaps 1 million Uyghur Muslim prisoners in forced labor camps in the West. So that is the reality we face. And then what is Trump trying to fix? Not, as you've just pointed out, some of the things that many of us would care about. From his view, the big issue is China is cheating by stealing the intellectual property of U.S. companies, which is true and is a problem because if it's created here, you want to have it made here and U.S. workers to get the jobs making whatever the new invention is. But a lot of U.S. companies aren't doing that anyway.
I was going to
even if China weren't cheating,
right?
Or stealing the IP, because they're running to where they can pay workers less. So they're no one is chasing them out of the U.S. They're choosing to move to China to produce. And now what Trump is asking for is protect their intellectual property. Well, if you think about that, that makes it easier to go there. Because now you can go there, have the cheap wages, and have your intellectual property protected if he gets what he wants.
Oh, so this is protection of corporations, and
that
it has nothing
to
to do with jobs, as he's constantly talking about.
And then the second thing he's asking about is a real thing, which is China subsidizes a lot of products and has what a lot of people call predatory behavior. They will, for instance, buy up the competition and shut them down in another country. And that is about dominating the industries of the future. It's a program called China 2025, and it's a government plan to dominate in robotics and in transportation and in solar. And all of these practices are a policy to try and have it all come to China. Some of it's just pure cheating, but in a way it also is what we would call an industrial policy, which is a plan which we have given up ever having for our workers and our industries. And so the question might be more about not having a plan. It might be more about if you do those things, you can't trade that stuff. You can do it for your country, but then you can't dump it on the rest of the world. So those are the things that Trump is chasing after, IP and subsidies. And here's everything he's not doing that he ought to. Number one, he should be banning the products made in these concentration camps for political dissidents and Muslims. We are importing lots of goods made in these forced labor camps.
Well, that's horrendous. I follow the news and I haven't heard that. That's really something.
We can just ban it. We can just ban it. Number two, thinking about how to change some of the behaviors in China in a way that would help working people. The formula you have to use is how do you make it less comfortable to not change than to change? The Chinese elite are very happy with the situation. They have set up a system that has led to economic success and growing military strength and stability in their controlling the government. And how is it that not changing becomes a bigger problem than changing. And so we need to maximize the leverage we use, which this administration isn't doing because it's too Wall Street rigged. We, for instance, Trump is a one-trick pony with tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. Tariffs are part of the tool you use in the trade fight. But for instance, we could just cut off those imports from the prison labor camps. Or if the Wall Street factor in the administration weren't so strong, we could just stop allowing some of these Chinese government-owned and government-controlled and government-influenced companies to list on the U.S. stock market. Why should we be financing the predatory behavior? Or
because somebody's making money.
No, because Wall Street is. That's exact. Bingo. That's exactly
Yay,
right.
Juliana got it.
Perfect. Perfect. If I had that sound effect, I would have done it first.
Thank you.
Same thing with currency. China has trillions of U.S. dollars, more than it needs for its own economic purposes, and that keeps the value of the U.S. dollar up, so our exports are more expensive, not just in China, but around the world.
So
either we can intervene there or we can take action to bring down the value of the dollar. There are a lot of other things we can do to create the leverage, and then we have to have the right asks. And the asks for people are for China, A, to stop with the subsidies for exports, B, or 2, labor rights. People in China are making $2 an hour, working really hard, really smart.
But that's what Trump wants to happen here. I mean, the vision of...
It's not gonna... Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just saying the vision of this administration is to split the world into the haves and the $2 an hour workers.
Well, and that's why perhaps there is pressure within the administration to have some of these important asks not being pushed. So, I mean, obviously, yes, folks, if you think that what's going on now isn't working and you want to see a change, the first thing is to change who's the president.
Yes.
No doubt. But if we were talking about you as the president, the things I would advise you to do would be the same thing we do in all of our trade agreements that or that we fight for in all of our trade agreements, which is every country, as Elizabeth Warren regularly reminds us, wants to sell stuff here. We have enormous leverage. We can set conditions not for companies, but for people. And the first thing you would do is condition labor rights, the right to be able to have unions independently bargain for higher wages. That's number one. It should be the base of every one of our trade agreements to stop the race to the bottom. Banning the products made by slave labor, political prisoners, obvious, not complicated. And then finally, the currency. We have to actually do the currency fix that Trump campaigned he would do in his first day, but of course, with the Wall Street rigged Treasury Secretary, Mr.
Uh-oh, Lori, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Oh, sorry. Yes. So we have about a minute left, and a big question that I'd like to ask you is, well, so just keeping that in mind, what is the global impact of the trade war between the U.S. and China? What are we not seeing that's happening in other parts of the world?
That's a really complicated question.
Sorry.
That's fine.
You're going to have to come back.
The impact mainly is instability, and to some degree, it's not necessary instability because it has to do with the erratic, unpredictable, crazy way in which Trump is engaging in what is, on the other hand, a real fight and problem we have to deal with.
Maybe there's a plus to that. If people are like, well, I don't necessarily believe that strongman dictator over there, that might be, it's possible that could be a positive for the world in general.
That's an interesting perspective. From your mouth to God's ears.
I am grasping at straws here. Lori, thank you so much for coming on. As usual, there's always so many other things that I could ask you, and I do appreciate you providing some clarity and some direction for whomever is listening who is going to be running for office. You mentioned Elizabeth Warren. It sounds like her trade policies might be in line with something that you would suggest, and maybe she'll have you on her team.
Well, she and Senator Warren and Mayor de Blasio, there are a variety of people who are running for president who get this 100%, have been on this message forever, and it's clear we need to change. The question is the approach that Trump is using strategically or the asks that he's demanding going to fix the problem? And the answer, sadly, is no, but there are answers.
Lori Wallach is the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Lori, thanks for joining us on the program today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, gosh, there's always so much more to talk about. And now joining us on the program, Jarrett Murphy from Max and Murphy to talk about what's coming up on WBAI's 5 p.m. show. Max and Murphy. Jarrett, thanks for joining us. What's going on?
Good morning. So we're going to be talking tonight to Mayor de Blasio's Chief of Social Services. That's Steve Banks, the Commissioner of the Department of Social Services. He heads up the homeless shelter system, cash assistance, food assistance. We'll be talking about what's going on in terms of homelessness, as well as whether people who are receiving welfare and food stamps are getting a fair shake. So that's 5 p.m. on this channel, and obviously welcome your calls.
Absolutely. That's going to be wonderful. Max and Murphy, 5 p.m. on this channel. So you're going to take open calls with Steve Banks? Will Steve have to answer?
Try.
Ooh, that'll be
Yeah,
great.
he's going to have to answer to everybody.
This is the question you should ask him.
Okay.
Will de Blasio come on Waking Up with Juliana and King? That's the main question. I want everyone to call in.
Yes, yeah, we're going to focus on that exclusively.
Please, I appreciate that for a full hour.
Definitely.
Jarrett Murphy, 5 p.m. The show is Max and Murphy right here on WBAI. And again, you can listen on WBAI.org if you didn't get a chance to listen right away. Hey, so tomorrow we've got Richard Wolff coming on the show because I heard Richard on Tom Hartman's program, talking about the fact that there are some economic indicators happening sort of in the deep economy that maybe if you're not really an economist, it's hard to follow, that are suggesting that this big crash that Tom Hartman and others have been predicting for a while is not just on the horizon over there, but on the current within weeks horizon. So not to scare everybody, but stuff some of that money in your mattress and, I don't know, buy gold. I don't really know what the solution is. Hopefully Richard Wolff will have some personal ideas of what we can do, but he can also explain where we are, and I think that's very, very important. We also have Swetha Sasihar joining us. She's from Sustain US, the youth delegation to the UN. So we look forward to having her on the program tomorrow. And our king will be back if all goes well, and he could talk about what he was doing for peace, love, justice, and the American way in D.C. today. We missed him. He will be back, and we'll be back. I hope you have a great day. You've been listening to Waking Up on WBAI 99.5 FM. Keep listening. It's your channel for the truth. Have a great one.